This is Sunday, May the 5th, 2024, and we're continuing our study in the book of Romans, and we are in chapter 13. The last time we met, we only got through a couple of verses, and that was okay, because as you know, it's been our practice here to thoroughly take a look at each verse and to see what we can glean from it and milk from it, and see what we can apply to our life, and to get a perspective of what was being written at the time it was being written, for the culture that was being written to, but realizing it has an application for us today in 2024. The word of the Lord never has any loss of life in it, and we can continue to appreciate it and grow from it. As is our custom, we're going to start and read many of the verses here today, and see how far we go then by studying each verse. If you have your own Bible, you can turn in Romans chapter 13. There's also pew Bibles in front of you, or you can follow along on the screen up above here, and we'll read it together. We're in verse 1. Whoop, it jumped on me here. Just give me a second. Technology is great when it works. Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. Reading on in verse 3, for rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise for the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid. For it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Verse 5, therefore it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Verse 7, render to all what is due to them, tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Owe nothing to anyone except to love one another. For he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law. And verse 9, for this you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet. And if there is any other commandment, it is summed up in this saying, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. Do this knowing the time that is already the hour for which to awaken from sleep. For now, salvation is nearer to us than when we believed. Verse 12, the night is almost gone. The day is near. Therefore, let us lay aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. Verse 13, let us behave properly as in the day, not in carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual promiscuity and sensuality, not in strife and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh in regard to its lusts. We'll pause there for today, and we ask the Lord's blessing upon the reading of His Word as we now take a look at it verse by verse. Let me say, just as a quick reminder, that what we started last week is that there's the basic premise that is God ordained, that all authority comes from God. And therefore, as was pointed out, that means that anybody who's in an elected leadership position, God has ordained them to be there. And we say, how can that be? For many of them have already been destitute. They've been, like Hitler and like Pol Pot. And we can think of Mussolini. We can get down through the ages, Nero. we can pick out people which were certainly not God-honoring. But God uses every ruler for his own purposes. And sometimes it's a matter of bringing people to their feet and realizing they need to return back to God, to their knees and return back to God. It's to humble them. And so he uses it for his purposes. And sometimes in retrospect, we can look back historically and say, this may be what God was doing. It may be that sometimes we won't know until we get the glory. And as I say frequently, at that point, it won't matter. And yet we'll know everything. Or the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace as we sing that song. So we're going to pick up with verse 4 of chapter 13 today, which again it reads, "For it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing, for it is a minister of God, an avenger, who brings wrath on the one who practices evil." Well, this verse concludes a sentence that was begun in a previous verse. Paul has written that by doing good in our communities, we can live without fear of those in authority. Let me just say parenthetically, this is generally speaking, this is the way it should be. We're living in a time and age where people can do good and they can still say, you know what, there may be consequences for me doing good. We see increasingly that Christians are being persecuted, and they're not only for their faith or what they believe or taking a stand for God's word. But if you know historically, that was true in the first century. Paul experienced this. But generally speaking, keep your nose clean, you stay out of trouble. I'm sure many of you, your mothers may have told you that, or they may be telling you that now. Straighten up and fly right and avoid the consequences of evil behavior. It is God-given role of those in authority to keep order in the community. And again, we can say, that certainly is being tested right now as many people want to defund the police and want to not observe the laws that are on the books, turning criminals loose. But it goes here to say this is part of how God limits the influence of evil in the world. In 2 Thessalonians 2:7, which we took a look at last week. Those in authority will most often give their approval to people who are contributing to that order by making things better. Now, Paul describes people in positions of government authority as God's servants for our good. Well, that's one of the reasons he established government, is to provide order and to provide some consistency. Of course, not everyone in those positions would agree with that statement. They may not see themselves as servants of God. My guess is there's a lot of elected officials who do not see themselves as servants of God, and they don't recognize the fact, either openly or subconsciously, that they were placed there because God ordained it. So God doesn't care, though. He put them where they are for his own purposes. I ask you to try to keep that in mind. I have to remind myself that as we see what's happening throughout the world, in our own country, in our own localities, and by some of the things that people are engaged in or leadership positions. It doesn't matter to God because he put them there for his own purposes. He has a bigger picture than what we can see. In fact, Paul boldly states that God uses men and women in positions of government authority to execute his own wrath on wrongdoers. Whether knowingly or not, those in authority are avengers for God, used by him to punish criminals. If we as Christians choose to do what is wrong, sinful actions that break the law, we should be afraid of those in authority as well. Those of you here today, I'm going to say you're all God-fearing Christians, and you're you're all law-abiding citizens. And you understand that if you want to keep out of trouble, you keep out of trouble. You don't want to have consequences from the law. You do what's right. You do what's good. Don't go away from that just because we see a lot of things being turned upside down. Still stick with what God's called us to do, because he's the one who will eventually settle the score. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, I will repay, and we will stand to receive rewards when we get to glory. It should be kept in mind that Paul himself was a lawbreaker. He disobeyed the government, didn't he? He really did. He He really disobeyed God before he became Paul. And then he disobeyed the government because they kept throwing him into prison and say, we're going to let you out, but don't go preaching Christ. And he would come out and like Peter say, come on, boys, let's go to preach Christ. So he broke the law in order to do what God had called him to do. However, Paul followed his own teaching here by being submissive to the same government. He eventually paid for his crimes against the state with his life, as did many other apostles, yeah. All of them were martyred, met a horrendous death, except for John, who was exiled on the Isle of Patmos. Paul does not choose this passage to address the need to break the laws of men when they stand against God's direct commands to us. Instead, Paul makes clear that in the normal course of life, human authorities instituted by God carry out God's will by punishing people who do what is wrong. Christians, in that sense, should submit to those in authority, doing good in all cases, and obeying laws that are not a violation of Christian conscience. There's the codicil, that are not in violation of Christian conscience. We took a look at this last week, and there was a phrase I didn't quote last week, but some of you have heard it. I used to say to my boss, who was over me when I worked at the university, I will do anything you ask me to do as long as it's not illegal or immoral. And he respected that, but that was kind of the grounds. So I think that's what God's asking us to do. We need to obey the laws that are not in violation of a Christian conscience. We're going to move on to verse 5 of chapter 13 of the book of Romans. And therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. This verse is about our ultimate motivation as Christians for submitting to the human authorities in our lives, including those in government. Paul has written in the two previous verses that God uses those in government authority to express his wrath against people who do wrong. The kind of wrong that Paul is describing as criminal activity that hurts other people, which is like stealing or murder. This is one of the ways that all leaders, even the ungodly, serves God's will by restraining some kinds of evil on earth. Even Christians ought to be afraid of government and authorities when doing those kinds of wrong things. Paul writes, though, that such fear of those in authority is not the only reason to obey the law. So it's not the only reason to do it, just because you're fearful of the consequences. We should do it for the sake of consciousness. Okay? By that, Paul means that we should be in submission to human authorities because we know as Christians, well, it's the right thing to do. And if we didn't know it before, we see that that's what's being established here in Romans chapter 13. It is God's will for our lives. In a general sense, it's part of a Christian sense of humility. You know, another word for humility is submission, it's contriteness. It's the opposite of pridefulness, arrogance. We are not the ultimate authority. We all wrestle with that. Is it going to be our will? Is it going to be God's will? We'd like to think we're in control. So we're not the ultimate authority, so we ought to be submissive to those in power over us. It goes without saying that there are exceptions to the idea the government is a force for good. And we see many exceptions today unfolding. Many times we're scratching our head and there's question marks going on. And we might even say, I wonder what God's plan is for this. How can he let this happen? Where is the justice? Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, I will repay. If it doesn't happen now, it'll happen in eternity. Everybody's going to get their hair combed if they weren't in line with him. He spent much of his life in Roman prisons. We know that's true of Paul. He did so without attempting to harm or overthrow his captors. That's really submission. However, Paul was not obedient to the ungodly parts of the Roman law. He refused to stop preaching about Jesus, even with those in authority told him to. He understood that he was responsible to obey God first if it came to a choice between that and obeying human laws. That's a tough decision, and it may cost you your life. And I mean that in 2024. It may come a time when the persecution is going to be so intense that each and every one of us, individually or collectively, may be forced to take a stand. Are we going to do what God called us to do, and we're going to stick with him, or are we going to renounce him and do what we know is not God-honoring? Paul chooses not to address that in this passage, however. Truthfully, that is the exception, and it's not the rule. I think we ought to keep that in mind, that we see an awful lot of things that are going on today that they are the exception, they're not the rule. In the case of almost every law and human authority, submission is God's will for his children during our short time on this side of eternity. That's another perspective. Those of us who are believers and saved and we are assured of a place in eternity, we know this is only temporal. And even Paul addresses that. You can kill the body, but you can't kill the soul. And so we look forward to the time when we're with Christ for all eternity, which is a whole lot longer than the 70, 80, or no more than 120 years that we may experience on this earth. Submission and obedience are normally the same thing, but they are not always the same. We're going to move on to verse 6 of chapter 13, the book of Romans, where it says, "For because of this, you also pay taxes, for rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing." God is the one who has put every human authority in their position. We've established that. They exist to serve his purposes, including the purpose of punishing people who do bad things. The context of this and other passages makes it clear that Christians are obligated to disobey government when and only when they're compelled to disobey God. We're restating this again in another way. As a general rule, believers are commanded to cooperate with their government authorities. And now Paul gets to a specific example of submission to human government. That's the business of paying taxes. Just parenthetically, within the last week and a week and a half, I had a very minor discussion with a believer who was saying, it's not even right to pay taxes. Well, what's the Bible say? And I was very quickly said, well, what about Jesus, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, and unto God the things that are God's? Well, he said that's a good point. But there is a movement that has been going on for the last 20, 30 years, and some people have openly decided they're not going to pay taxes. And some of them, prominent figures, have ended up serving time in jail because of the refusal to pay taxes. And yet we know that biblically speaking, God has called us to do what we're supposed to do and to help fund the government. So Christians are taxpayers, Paul writes, because those taxes support the work God intends to do through the human authorities and he has put in place. Even when those men or women stand against the truth of God, their fundamental role as order keepers is still part of God's will. This is a very controversial position even among the Jewish leaders of Jesus and Paul's day. Critics tried to trip Jesus up by asking him if it was lawful to pay taxes to the Roman ruler Caesar. And Jesus, pointing out that Caesar's picture is on the money, stated flatly that the taxes should be paid. So in Matthew 22, 15 to 22, it reads, "Then the Pharisees went and they plotted together how they might trap him and what he said." That's what they constantly did, right? Trying to figure out how they could trip him up. Verse 16, "And they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians, saying, 'Teacher, we know that you are truthful and teach the way of God in truth, and defer to no one, for you are not partial in any way.'" They're trying to grease the skids, aren't they? They're trying to puff them up a little bit, but Jesus can't have that happen. But they went on to say, then tell us then, what do you think? Is it lawful to give a poll tax to Caesar or not? But Jesus perceived their malice. He knew everything, and he said, "Why are you testing me, you hypocrites? Verse 19, show me the coin used for the poll tax. And they brought him a denarius. And he said to them, whose likeness and inscription is on this? And they said to him, well, Caesar's. Then he said to them, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. In hearing this, they were amazed, and leaving him, they went away. So those are Jesus' own words and his own concepts. So I think we all agree that, yeah, looks like we need to pay taxes. In a similar manner, some of the modern day have suggested Christians should not pay taxes if the government is funding evil practices. And Jesus and Paul disagree. Both paid taxes to the same government that ultimately killed them and persecuted other Christians as well. Neither endorsed the option of not paying taxes as a matter of conscience. Paul's larger point is that we must trust God to provide for us as his children. In the case of this passage that includes provision through the government authorities he puts in place, God is fully capable of using them for our good, no matter who they are or what their intentions. As we're living day to day, we can continue to scratch our heads and say, well, I can't see it. But that's part of trusting God. As part of trusting God, we walk by faith, not by sight. Even though we may not be able to see it, God's got a plan. And I don't know about you, but I have to remind myself that about 5 times a day. It's just part of what goes on. Then we read on to verse 7 of chapter 13 of the book of Romans. Render to all what is due them, tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. If every word in the Bible is inspired by God, and that means Paul just penned this, but he was inspired to write this, we can with a surety say, Paul said it, the Spirit told him to write it, so this settles the issue. Render to all what is due them, tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. So now Paul concludes this section by submitting to government authorities with a broader statement about paying what is owed in every sense of the word. In short, Paul describes Christians as people who pay what is owed in all cases. This includes taxes, as described in the previous verse, revenue, meaning money, as well as respect and honor. And while they're obligated to disobey openly ungodly commands, Christians are to live lives in general of lawful obedience. Within the context of this section, adding the words respect and honor to what believers owe government may make Paul's teaching even more difficult. Paul's letters go even further when he instructs that we must honor the emperor. We can read about that in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 to 17, which reads, submit yourselves for the Lord's sakes to every human institution, whether to a king, as to the one in authority, or to governors, as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do it right. For such is the will of God, that by doing right you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. Act as free men, and do not use your freedom as a covering for evil, and use it as bondslaves of God. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the king. I don't know about you, but there's sometimes, and I have to watch myself, that I tend to be rather questioning. I'll even go so far as to say critical of things that I see those who are in leadership are doing, from the highest levels of this government down to local government. And yet we know that God's put them there for a reason, and what we need to do is respect them. And what we again need to say to ourselves, as I do frequently and every day, God has a plan. Don't see it right now, but he has a plan, and he's put them in authority for a purpose and for a reason, even though what they're doing certainly may not be God-honoring. It's important to note that the difference between giving respect and honor versus having a high opinion of or voicing praise for somebody. That helps to put it in perspective. Okay? There's a difference between having high opinion or praising somebody and giving respect and honor. We need to respect the position. We may not have a high opinion or praise the person who's in the position currently, but we need to respect the position itself. Paul does not command living sacrifice Christians to have positive thoughts for every authority figure. Nor does he command believers to advocate or defend them when they are wrong. Well, that's kind of going back to saying, is it God honoring? Can I support this? Well, we may not support it. It may be that we just have to just live with it and do the best we can. Instead, Paul eliminates the option, for us to speak and to act in ways that are disrespectful and dishonoring. So we don't have that as an option. We can't be disrespectful. We can't be dishonoring. And can I tell you something? I wrestle with that sometimes because I get so concerned about what I see happening that sometimes I may say things that come out, or I may express attitudes that are disrespectful, and they certainly aren't honoring. So it's an admonition for all of us as another level of trusting God. And as believers, you've heard me say it before, but I think it's worth repeating. As Christians, we have two options. We either trust God or we trust God. It's the only option we have. Beginning with Jesus and Paul and the other apostles, Christianity has a long history of civil disobedience to those in authority. There's nothing new under the sun. Most famously, Peter and the other apostles continued to preach the gospel when ordered not to do that. They said, we must obey God rather than men. We've looked at that several times already in the last week. And most of them paid for their position with their lives, that submission in contrast to obedience. Even in those circumstances, though, those martyred believers did not refuse to be respectful or honoring toward those in positions of what they believed to be God-given authority. Paul's larger point is that Christians should never be known as people who defy and disrespect authority, especially in matters not related to obeying God. I think that's a key operating principle. And I would say to you, from what I know of those who are here gathered today, I don't think that's anything that you would do. But we know that there's unfortunately, there are some people who would claim to be Christians that may say they're going to defy and disrespect authority. We may have, and I don't know, have even seen examples of that, these college campuses over the last couple of weeks. We don't know what their belief is or where they stand. But you know that there are some people who say they're Christians who really think they should hate the Jews. And that certainly isn't God honoring. He's got a plan for the Jews, and we got to respect them. He's going to be there. We need to pray for them because they're still God's chosen people. That hasn't changed down through the years. Paul's larger point is that Christians should never be known as people who defy and disrespect authority, especially in matters not related to obeying God. So in addition, he insists that our acts of respect, honor, and submission to human authorities are, in truth, acts of faith in the God who provides for us. They are acts of faith in the God who provides for us. So we have to trust him. We have to trust that he sees things that we don't see. We know that his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. His ways are higher than our ways. We don't see it from his perspective, but we know who's going to win in the end. And he is still in control, and he's still in charge. We read on now to verse 8 of chapter 13 of the book of Romans, where it says, "Owe nothing to anyone except to love one another. For he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law." Paul transitions here from discussing what is owed to human authorities, including respect and honor, to what is owed to everyone. The command to owe no one anything should not necessarily be read as a command to Christians to never borrow money for any reason. The sense of the Greek is that we should not let any debt remain outstanding, that we should not keep on owing anyone for anything. So what does that mean? Well, if you borrow, you need to settle your debt as soon as you possibly can, or within the time frame that may have been previously agreed to. That may be understood as a requirement to always pay what we owe in a timely manner according to whatever agreement we've made to the lender. Or, put it another way, do not live lives of constant dependency, borrowing, or unreliability. Okay? I think we all know that there are many people today, increasingly in Nunner, that believe that they can go ahead and spend and do without any consequences or any feeling that they need to pay back, but to keep their hand out and keep looking for more. And that's not God honoring. That's not what he's talking about here. In truth, however, Paul is primarily concerned with the money here, as the following verses will show. He wants people to talk about our obligation as Jesus followers to love other people, including our neighbors. He seems to say that loving others is a debt we will never pay off. We will never be done with paying love to each other. We're never going to be done paying love to each other. How does continuing to pay our debt to love others fulfill the law exactly? Well, Paul was reflecting what Jesus said are the two greatest commandments, to love God and our neighbors, in Mark 12:29-31, which reads, Jesus answered, the foremost is, hear, O son of Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind, with all of your strength. The second is this, that you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And there is no other commandment greater than these. Simply love God with all you have, then love your neighbor as yourself. Paul will show in the following verses that Christ-like love will naturally motivate us to keep all the other relationship commands in the law. We're going to pause there for today and pick it up with verse 9 the next time that we meet. Let's just pause for a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the opportunity to study your word today. We know there's some things that we've looked at from your perspective which may not resonate with the reality that we think we're experiencing. Help us, Lord, with our unbelief. Help us to be increasingly more trustful of you, your ways. Help us, Lord, to understand, obey the concept of submission. Submission, first of all, to you, not our will, but your will be done. And then the necessary submission to those in authority, and obeying the laws that are part of the land as long as they're not in contradiction to what you would have us to do. Help us, Lord, to reflect upon our actions each day. Help us to remember that you do have a plan, that you're in control, you're still on the throne, and ultimately you win. And so, Lord, help us also not to seek vengeance, knowing that that's something you'll take care of. So we thank you for your word. We thank you for the fact that it is sacred, it's solid, it's dependable, and it never changes. And we praise you and thank you in the wonderful name of Jesus.